Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Ask TWW. It's been a while since we've done one of these Q&As, but the cool thing is, if you want, you could watch it as a video or listen to it as a podcast on YouTube Music. And if you want to get your question on the show, just become a supporter here on YouTube. The YouTube membership area at any level will ask you for questions each week. I answer those questions, but some of them may end up here. And we also have a Patreon if you want to support us there. Same thing happens there. So this is going to be a mix of Patreon and YouTube questions. So our topics today include what happened to my hybrid workbench, difficulty getting good results with a jointer, self-centering bits, ripping down stock to help it dry faster, and knockdown hardware. What are you guys doing? Just chill. Relax. So first up, we've got a question from Adam. He says, possible I've missed this elsewhere, but wondering what became of your hybrid workbench? I notice in your latest videos, you're back to using the original Rubo. So some of you may recall, my original Rubo workbench was auctioned off for charity, so that's long gone. When I moved to Missouri, we hired my brother-in-law, Jay, and he needed a place to work, so I gave him the hybrid workbench. Quite honestly, I did not feel like building yet another workbench, so I just bought mine from Benchcrafted, so that became my main, and once Jason left, we wound up with this two workbench situation. So now the hybrid workbench sits in the small bay and is used for various tasks like making sandpaper, and my primary user is the new Cherry Rubo that I bought from Benchcrafted. Now, if you're curious, both of those workbenches are courses in the Wood Whisperer Guild. If you want to check that out, of course, I'll put some links in the description for you. All right, next question is from StriperSeeker, and I'm not going to lie, when I first saw this, I thought that was StriperSeeker, and I had a whole great joke planned, but then I saw the fish and realized it was StriperSeeker, so he's a fisherman. Anyway, so am I. I'm sure this has been asked before, but when using a jointer, is pressure on the infeed or the outfeed table? I can't seem to get crooks out of boards, bows on the edge, or even bowing on the face no matter what I do. The piece always rocks left and right when on the narrow 5/4 edge, or front and back when on the face. Eventually I wind up with a piece that I can't use because it's too thin or narrow. Is there a trick? I know about using straight edges along the table fence, but I only have 4-foot levels and I have 8-foot pieces sometimes. I have a new Powermatic 8-inch jointer and the tables are coplanar as much as I can get them, and the outfeed table is level. Any tricks or tips? Do you have a video on doing it? Right, so I've got a couple of videos, pretty old videos, on both jointer use and then setup and calibration, because I think those will probably help you out. The real thing I'm looking at here is you're talking about an 8-foot board. Even on the biggest jointers that most of us are capable of having, 8 foot is asking a lot, especially if you have a very misshapen board. So oftentimes what I will do is use a circular saw, a track saw, or a hand plane to kind of prep that edge a little bit before putting it on the jointer, because if I can get it mostly flat or a lot closer to flat, that long edge will behave a lot better on the jointer and won't cause you as many problems. So that's warning number one. You just want to make sure that you actually have a board that is capable of being jointed on the type of jointer that you have. The other thing is when I hear people talk about pressure, especially when it comes to a jointer, I start thinking about calibration. And the reason is because a jointer should not really be difficult to use. You're just kind of controlling the workpiece, passing it over the cutter head and moving it to the outfeed table. If you're really focusing and like manhandling this thing and pushing down real hard, something's wrong, right? So I would say either your blades are dull, maybe you need wax on the table, or possibly the jointer itself is out of calibration. So just to describe the way that I do pass these things, if we're going to break it down, I will put my pads on top of the workpiece. I put just enough pressure to control the workpiece. I'm not looking to manhandle it and muscle it down. My control and pressure is on the infeed side until about half of the board is over that cutter head. Once half is over, then I'm going to switch my pad location to the outfeed side and put a little bit of pressure there and start to just kind of walk the piece across that cutter head. And that's really it. There's really not much more to the technique than that. And if it does require a lot more out of you, then I really would recommend revisiting that calibration process and then just making sure that you're not doing boards that are way out of whack and way too long for the jointer.
Welcome to my shop. My name is Caleb James. I want to introduce you to our Wood Whisperer Guild project. This is a round top 3-legged table, and we're going to learn a few skills in this project that I think you'll enjoy. In this project, we're going to talk about a unique method to align boards so it makes glue ups really easy. I'm going to be showing you how to cut large diameter circles with ease, and then I'm going to show you some methods for turning. So we'll talk about some of the fundamentals of setting up your lathe and using your basic tools. And then we'll go into making compound cuts at our table saw, utilizing both the miter gauge and the tilt of our blade. I think you'll enjoy this project. It's going to expand your skills in woodworking and take you beyond 90 degrees and square. So for more information, visit thewoodwhispererguild.com.
All right, next question is from Derik, and all right, I don't know if you could tell, but I'm recording at home. My wife is here, my mom is here, the dogs are here. It's a good time to record. Anyway, Derik has a question about self-centering bits. He wants to know if I have any recommendations. He says, I've gone through 2 sets that have been horrible and do not drill in the center. Interesting. I've actually never had that happen. I mean, most sets that I've had will do a sort of concentric hole, and it's okay. But anyway, if you're not familiar, a self-centering bit is pretty cool. We often use...
What are you doing?
My Q&A.
Oh.
Thank you. So if you're not familiar, a self-centering bit is just a little bit that has a spring-loaded housing that kind of centers itself on any piece of hardware. And typically you use the hardware itself as a guide and do your drilling. And it just keeps that drill bit for pilot holes nice and centered. And they usually come in, 3 or 5 piece sets. The one I have is from Snappy Tools, and it's never really let me down. Now, this is not something I use every day, but anytime I install hardware, I'm going to use that. So I haven't had any issues with this particular Snappy set, and maybe there's better ones out there. That's the one I use, and that's the one I recommend. Currently, there's a 3-piece set on Amazon for $29.71. You know how prices go. It might fluctuate a little bit, but I'll be sure to put my affiliate link in the description if you want to pick one up. So next up, we've got a question from TheGhostofRigbyReardon. I have some 1x6x8 Western red cedar boards that I'll be ripping in half to make slats for a planter box. The wood is mostly dryish, 12 to 20%. I've got it drying out a bit before staining and sealing it, but is it better to let it fully dry before ripping, or is it okay to do it now? Would that help the drying process or cause more problems with potential warping? All right, this is interesting. There's a lot going on when you have a board that's got a little bit too much moisture. That Western red cedar, especially, from a construction place or big box store, a lot of times can be pretty darn wet. So good idea to let some of that extra moisture leave your boards. One quick tip is if you are using these for something outside and you put them in your shop, well, the shop doesn't have quite as much air circulation. So if you can, I'd actually recommend leaving those boards outside in a covered area so they don't get exposed to rain. They have plenty of airflow, leave space between each board, and then outdoors, I think with the air exchange that you have out there, you're going to wind up having them dry a lot faster. But what he's asking about is, can I cut these down? So if you look at the way wood generally leaves, or moisture leaves a board, you're going to lose it from the outside surfaces. It's like a sponge, right? It's going to dry on the outside before it dries at the core. So by splitting it down the middle or milling it to some extent, you can expose those fresh fibers and let the very wet core dry a little faster. The trick with that, though, is that can impart instability. It dries a little bit too fast, and that can cause the boards to warp. So it's a bit of a gamble when you do something like this. So what I would recommend is if you have enough material there in the thickness and the width that you can do a rip, and you still have a decent amount of material to remill these pieces if they should decide to move a lot, that's what I would recommend doing. If you are working with pieces that are pretty close to final dimension, and once you rip them, you don't have much room to spare, that might be a little bit risky. I might not chance that at this stage. Now, while it's not 100% related to this question, I have a pretty good video on outdoor finishes that just gives you an idea of really how brutal things can be outside on outdoor furniture, and it's just kind of a review of how some of these finishes have held up over time. You might want to check that one out. And wrapping things up today, we've got a question from Matthew. He asks, what knockdown hardware would you use for a child's bassinet? Well, the hardware I use would be the same for any piece of furniture, especially one that a child will go into, and that's really the best one that I know of. It's Festool's hardware. The problem is it's really expensive, and it requires that you have a domino or access to a domino. Their connector system is just fantastic. I've used it on, probably 5 or 6 pieces of knockdown furniture. It holds up well. It doesn't damage the material. I think that's one of the challenges you have with knockdown hardware is if you truly are going to assemble and disassemble this thing, some of the cheaper hardware is a little bit destructive in that time. As you're assembling and disassembling, things get a little bit looser each and every time you use it. And I don't really have that issue with the Festool hardware. So I built bunk beds. I've built, smaller pieces. So if you could either borrow the domino, or if you have the budget to get one, obviously it's a very useful tool for other things too. I would highly recommend that as knockdown hardware. Aside from that, there are pieces I've done in the past that were just cobbled together from, you know, hardware store solutions. Now, I'm not really a big fan of like the cam type tightening that you see on just a lot of manufactured knockdown flat pack furniture. So what I would recommend is doing your own. If you use a combination of threaded inserts and connector bolts, you could do quite a bit if you just think in terms of how those pieces would come together. And oftentimes what I'll do is have a mortise and tenon joint, for instance, for a structural component, and then reinforce that mortise and tenon joint with a connector bolt and a threaded insert to hold everything together. And that's a great way to use just inexpensive materials, and you could do something way better than a manufactured piece of furniture. And especially for something like a bassinet, you really would probably benefit from having real structural joinery. It's just that there's no glue involved. You just have hardware holding everything together, but it's the mortise and tenon joint that's doing all the work. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed this Q&A. We'll be doing these a lot more regularly going forward, and if you want to help support the show and have a chance of getting your question answered in this format, you can go to patreon.com/woodwhisperer, or right here on YouTube, we've got the membership that you could join, and at any level, you'll have an opportunity to ask a question each week. I'll answer that question either way, and then sometimes the questions may end up in this format in our Ask TWW show. All right, so thank you for your support, everybody, over the years, and I will see you later.